Streaming now.
Okay, good.
Okay, one second. Let me try this then.
We'll figure out our tech troubles, but I'm glad you made this work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Weekly WED. Before we start, I want to preface this by saying that we are streaming the session on YouTube and LinkedIn at Business School of AI. By joining the Zoom, you give permission to us to be included in the recording, which we'll post anywhere or store or use. If you don't want to be included, you can turn off your camera and type your questions, and I'll field it to our speaker. Those of you on LinkedIn can post a question in comments. Okay. My name is Pariya, Sarin, and I'm your host for today. I am an incoming college student studying information technology as a part of the Weekly WED team. And today I'm joined by our guest speaker, Patrick Lin. Patrick K Lin is an author and lawyer focused on artificial intelligence, privacy law, technology policy and regulation, and intellectual property. Previously, he worked for the ACLU, EFF, and FTC, among others. He also serves on the junior board of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project and advises Snap Incorporation as an AI specialist on its safety advisory board. While completing his law degree, Patrick wrote Machine See, Machine Do, an approachable and informative book about technology, policy, and the criminal legal system. Now I'm going to give an introduction on what Patrick will be talking about today before I hand it over to him. In July 2023, it was revealed that the Federal Trade Commission opened an investigation into OpenAI. There is understandably plenty of excitement around what such an investigation might reveal about the company and its tight-lipped development and maintenance of ChatGPT. However, the FTC Civil Investigative Demand Letter already provides us with some important revelations. The AI governance and risk management practices the FTC expects AI companies to have in place. So now I'm going to hand it over to Patrick to introduce himself further. And for those live, please put your questions in the chat while he does his presentation. And afterwards, there's going to be a Q&A, so that's another opportunity to ask your questions. So yeah, I'm handing it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Pariya. Is everyone able to see my screen okay? Pariya, is the screen showing up?
I can see.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. So thank you everyone for joining. And for those of you tuning in on LinkedIn and YouTube, thanks for joining us there. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I think this is a really interesting development and something that I've been following pretty closely. So we're here today to answer this question I have on the screen here. We ultimately want to figure out sort of what this FTC investigation OpenAI means for AI. OpenAI sort of become the poster child of the AI industry and generative AI at large. And so this is really the first time a government agency is conducting such an investigation, and it has, I think, for very understandable reasons, led to quite a media response, and a lot of people are kind of tuning in and trying to see what the outcome might involve. But before we jump into that, I do want to give just a quick, overview of, my background, a little bit about me and who is speaking to you all today. And so, as Pariya had said in my introduction, I'm the author of Machine See, Machine Do. A lot of my background is really focused on the biases of artificial intelligence and a lot of technologies that rely on data, historical data in particular, to make decisions about the public and how public institutions use digital technologies to surveil, police, and ultimately make decisions about the public and people like you and me. And so my background is really focused on sort of that legal and criminal justice side of things. But a lot more recently, I would say in the past year or so, generative AI has really sort of taken the limelight. And so my work has actually shifted a little bit to focusing on a lot of the intellectual property concerns of AI, and now a bit more recently with generative AI. And so a lot of my research and work is really focused on actually how this technology impacts artists and media and entertainment, and sort of seeing the response of the writer's strike, the actor's strike in Hollywood, how that's sort of been a response in a lot of ways to generative AI and the concerns of that technology replacing and displacing workers. And so I think it's a really interesting time to get involved and to learn about artificial intelligence. And we're seeing it really become pervasive and impact so many different industries. So that's a little bit about sort of my research and my day-to-day work. But on the side, I also am involved in a couple, I think, really fun and cool organizations. First, I'm part of the junior board of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, which is a nonprofit that's mostly based in New York, but does work across the whole country and does research into other countries as well. But is really focused on sort of how AI and other data-driven technologies are used to surveil people. It started off really doing a lot of litigation work and has kind of evolved to do a lot of advocacy and education as well. And then a few months ago, I was invited to join Snap Inc. to be a part of their safety advisory board, and I'm one of two AI specialists there. Snap is starting to sort of roll out some generative AI features in their app, incorporating ChatGPT like functionality in their app, and then also rolling out new features as well. And so I was invited to sort of provide advice on how to avoid biases, sexual intellectual property issues, and that's been a really fun and interesting opportunity as well. And so that's just a little bit about my background.
And Patrick, since writing your book, what changes have you noticed in AI?
Sure. So I would say since writing my book, so my book was published back in the end of 2021. Back then, generative AI was sort of, there were mumblings of it, but it wasn't quite as prominent as it is now. And so at that point, I think a lot of my work focusing on bias remains relevant today. I think there's still a lot of concerns about the training data that's used to develop, applications like ChatGPT and others. But I would say generative AI has really taken off as sort of the main AI application that we're talking about today, that we're focused on, and that even regulators are kind of tuning in and figuring out what can be done in that space. And it's been interesting to see people who are outside of the technology space really talk about AI too. And just, I think seeing people play around with ChatGPT, and that's been sort of the biggest change, I think. I think AI has become a much more, prominent and relevant topic, even more so than it was just a year or two ago. And so that's been interesting to see, and I think in some ways concerning too. I think AI is still a very new technology. Yeah.
And if you could perhaps add on to your book right now, what would be the one thing you would want to focus on from 2021 to now?
Yeah, I think because the book itself is focused so much on the effect of artificial intelligence on the public, I see myself focusing a lot actually on the misinformation and disinformation issues that arise with using generative AI, right? I think something that I'll talk about later on in the presentation is sort of like AI hallucinations and how AI isn't always the best fact checker, right? It's more concerned about being able to fulfill a user query, but it doesn't do the homework to actually determine whether that information is necessarily accurate, right? And so I think with respect to how AI impacts people and government institutions, I think I would probably, if I were to add a chapter or something, I would probably talk about how AI impacts things like civic engagement and democracy.
Yeah. And so that also has, I don't know, I can also share at the end, but thank you, Patrick, for that.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And so before we really get into the bulk of today's discussion about the FTC investigation, I thought it'd be important to set some expectations about what this investigation will involve, right? Because I think a lot of ink has been spilled about sort of these, I think earth-shattering revelations, right? The investigation, the way that journalists and I think a lot of commentators have written about it, is that the FTC investigation could really represent an unparalleled level of disclosure from OpenAI, and that company has really been tight-lipped and quite secretive about the development and maintenance of ChatGPT. Very little is known about how it's trained, what data it uses, and what's used sort of on the back end to reinforce the AI and train it as users use it and rely on outputs and things like that. And so there's sort of a lot of discussion about, oh, this will tell us a lot about OpenAI and ChatGPT. But the reality is FTC investigations are conducted on a non-public basis. And so while the civil investigative demand letter was leaked, it's a 20-page document that we'll talk about later on in this presentation. The answers that are asked in a lot of in that letter, a lot of those answers will remain private, and I think the bulk of it probably will be. And so that's something to understand going into this, is that this isn't like a police investigation, right? Where at the end there's a big press conference where Lina Khan from the FTC will come out and say, here are all the things we discovered or learned about OpenAI, and here's what to look out for. We are very unlikely to get something like that. But I think a silver lining here is that a part of the FTC Act, which is a piece of legislation that gives the FTC the power to do these investigations, it actually authorizes the agency to make public disclosures in very sort of narrow circumstances. And one of those exceptions is when disclosure would actually serve the public interest. Now, I do think that some of the things the FTC will ultimately learn from their investigation will serve the public interest, right? And then we'll get into what that involves. But because the FTC is so focused on really two things, right? Ensuring that companies are operating in a competitive way and not forming monopolies. And in this case, consumer protection, right? That consumer protection piece is really informing the FTC investigation here into OpenAI because of the things they're concerned about. And we've seen time and time again where the FTC does conduct these investigations, but does reveal some information. Things like, oh, this company is selling your data to Facebook or Twitter, or this company does not have very good cybersecurity controls in place. And so data leaks have been an issue. And so they will actually inform the public about those problems and tell the public, here's what we told this company to do so that this leak or this unauthorized sale of your data won't happen again. And so that's where we might see some disclosures about what OpenAI is doing and how ChatGPT operates. And that's sort of what I think I'm certainly interested and excited about, and I'm sure a lot of you would be interested to learn as well. And so that brings us into the civil investigative demand letter itself. If you just Google the FTC civil investigative demand into OpenAI, you'll find it as one of the top results. And I believe it's also linked in this week's Weekly Wed newsletter as well. And so it's a 20-page document, so it's not particularly long, but it does contain a lot of questions, dozens of questions, in fact. And so I've just included sort of a few high-level sort of summaries of those questions here. But a lot of what the FTC is really focused on is, how does OpenAI collect, source, and retain its data? How does OpenAI train ChatGPT? How does OpenAI evaluate the accuracy and reliability of ChatGPT's outputs? That goes into sort of the misinformation, disinformation I was mentioning earlier, right? ChatGPT will give you an answer most times, but whether that answer is correct, accurate, or reliable to use is a whole nother question. And then what is OpenAI's process of, and these are the FTC's words, it's reinforcement learning through human feedback. And so that's a process of relying on human users, right, correcting ChatGPT as they use it, and how that data is ultimately used to update and improve ChatGPT. And as a part of the demand letter, the FTC also demands OpenAI to list all of its data sources. And so this includes websites, third parties, and even data scraping tools. And so that would be a really huge revelation if we do get to learn about how OpenAI is trained and what they're relying on to provide us with their outputs when we use it. Yeah, and so these are, again, it's a 20-page document, so there's quite a few questions, but at a high level, these are the concerns that the FTC is essentially voicing through their letter to OpenAI. And again, because these investigations are done privately, it's interesting that the letter was ultimately leaked. It was the Washington Post that ultimately received the copy that is available on the internet today. But again, this is usually the civil investigative demand letters typically not published. And so something I mentioned a couple of slides back is that the FCC, one of their greatest concerns and focuses as an agency is enforcing consumer protection laws. And so the FTC in this particular investigation is primarily interested in whether OpenAI and its product ChatGPT have essentially run afoul of consumer protection laws. What the FTC has specifically called out is privacy and data security issues and reputational harm. From a privacy and data security perspective, the commission will likely evaluate OpenAI's data collection practices and data retention policies, right? When you input your own proprietary code into OpenAI and ask it to, or into ChatGPT and ask it to correct a bug in it, or when you're asking it to write an essay for you about a particular topic, ChatGPT holds onto that data. And it's ultimately used to train future iterations of it. And so the FTC is interested in sort of learning more about how it's obtaining the data. Is it secure? Is it safe? What happens if you as an individual user share, what if you share very personal and sensitive information? Is OpenAI on the hook for protecting you or protecting that data? That's something the FTC is concerned about. And so the FTC investigation into the privacy and data security issues, that's really unsurprising for, I think, a lot of people who are in the technology and regulation space. The FTC has, over the past decade or so, actually clamped down on a lot of tech, big tech companies, especially on privacy and data security issues. And so a lot of that, again, comes down to things like, is this company storing your data in a way that is safe and secure? Was there a big data leak? And can the company show to the FTC that it had good controls in place and that it has good cybersecurity practices in place, and things like that? And so privacy and data security is a very unsurprising part of the investigation, but cases involving reputational harm are much rarer. This is something that the FTC actually doesn't really focus on all that much. Especially since Linacon has taken over, there's a big emphasis on tech companies, their privacy and data security practices, sometimes their advertising and how they sort of what they say their AI can do, things like that. That's been really the focus of the FTC's investigations, in the last few years. So the reputational harm piece was really surprising for a lot of people. But I think here, the FTC's interest in reputational harm is most likely connected to large language models' tendency to hallucinate or ultimately generate, misinformation. And so a persistent concern about ChatGPT since its launch is whether the AI chatbot could be an engine for spreading misinformation, right? ChatGPT has fabricated fake news articles, scientific papers even, and has even made up sort of fake judicial decisions, like fake like court opinions. And so a recent example of this is in June 2023, ChatGPT's hallucination resulted in a defamation lawsuit actually against OpenAI when it spread false information about a Georgia radio host, accusing him of embezzling money from a company. And so reputational harm may be sort of a way for the FTC to assess OpenAI's sort of retraining and refining process as it relates to AI hallucinations, as well as procedures for addressing sort of those false, misleading, and harmful statements that do ultimately impact consumers, right? And so in the case of the radio host, even if he himself was not using ChatGPT, ChatGPT was generating comments that was ultimately harming him. It resulted in false accusations against him. And so that would still fall under the purview of consumer protection laws, which FTC is concerned about.
And Patrick, let's just touch upon.
So I think what is probably the most interesting right now, right? Because we won't know much about what the FTC finds out about OpenAI for quite some time. But I think just looking at the civil investigative demand letter itself, I think it provides a bit of a blueprint. I think it shows sort of what the FTC is really worried about, right? It makes sense to be really excited about, oh, like what will we learn about OpenAI? What we learn about ChatGPT? But the result of this investigation, like it will offer a lot of, I think, really interesting insights to the AI industry at large, but also specifically OpenAI. But right now, we essentially have like a high-level checklist for like AI governance practices that likely align with what the FTC is looking for from like a regulatory expectation point of view. And because the FTC is so concerned with consumer protection, a lot of the questions in its civil investigative demand letter is really geared towards that, right? How are you handling user data? How are you making sure that the data or the answers you're providing to users is accurate? Are you doing that work on the back end? It'll be interesting to see how other AI companies respond to that, because I think this is a way to, as I say here, putting AI companies on notice, right? The FTC is essentially, because this document has been leaked, this demand letter lets all the other AI companies know, here's what we are looking at, right? Are you compliant with, are you able to respond to these questions in a way that we are content with? And so I think it'd be really wise for other, AI companies and developers to really read through this letter and say, are we doing enough to make sure that our data is secure? Are we doing enough to make sure that our answers and our outputs are reliable and are not spreading misinformation? Things like that. And so I think that's one of the most interesting and I think impactful pieces of this the investigation is what we can learn in this moment, right? And so beyond that, a lot of people in sort of the legal space too have been thinking, what does the FTC investigation mean for the regulatory landscape? Does this mean that we're going to expect more laws? Do we think there'll be more rules around how AI is developed, how it's built? Will this slow down innovation in some way, right? And so I don't necessarily think it'll slow down innovation, but I do think that the FTC action here is really meant to kind of be a counterbalance to Congress. I'm sure a lot of you here have heard, countless congressional or Senate hearings from sort of big players in the AI space talking about we need regulation, we don't need regulation. There's been a lot of discourse, right? And I think, to some extent, it makes sense for Congress to kind of be slow to act in regulating because the United States wants to remain competitive in the AI space, right? While I think a lot of the biggest names in AI right now are based in America, India and China, for example, are some of the biggest players in developing generative AI and AI tools as well. And so the U.S. wants to make, continue being competitive in that sort of AI, arms race, if you will. But at the same time, there's also concern about whether this technology, harms individuals, whether there's bias in this technology and how that also impacts the way that's being used. And again, misinformation impacts how effectively a democracy can function, right? But these are sort of, for Congress, they're slower to act because these are kind of competing interests. They want to remain competitive, but they also don't know necessarily how to balance that with protecting individuals. But that's where the FTC doesn't necessarily have this same dilemma in place because their sort of mandate is consumer protection. They're less concerned about being able to compete with other countries in this space. Their focus is really on how do we make sure that users are not being harmed? How do we make sure individuals and consumers are not being harmed by this technology? And so that's where the FTC is able to, I think, work much faster than Congress. And that's why we have an FTC investigation, but we haven't had any kind of congressional, regulation in place yet. And so the last piece of it is, again, like only time will tell. FTC investigations take at least 1 year to complete. Oftentimes it can take up to 2. And especially because the FTC, as sort of, I think, impressive and nimble as the agency is, it is, I would, at least my opinion is, it's quite underfunded. And it's a small group of regulators and lawyers sifting through potentially like troves of data and information. And so it will take a lot of time to actually go through everything that OpenAI provides, if they are able to provide all that information that is being demanded of them. But what's interesting is that the FTC has, in the past, required companies to make certain actions, to take certain actions after they complete their investigation. For example, the FTC has required companies to delete data in the past, or to change the way that their company operates in order to comply with their expectations of them. One of the most famous examples of that is back in 2019, the FTC reached a settlement with Facebook. But not only did the FTC impose a historic $5 billion fine on Facebook, but it also imposed new privacy requirements and actually required them to create greater oversight over third-party applications, making sure that data was more secure, and actually required them to completely overhaul their cybersecurity and anti-data leak programs at Facebook. And so these are changes that I don't think Facebook would have necessarily made on their own if there wasn't a fine or a requirement by the government. And so I think that's where there is this sort of push and pull between the classic sort of Silicon Valley of like move fast, break things, right? Like that's sort of been the approach that a lot of companies have taken to try to innovate and make things as quickly as possible, to release a product and let it kind of be used as an experiment by the public. But that's where I think agencies like the FTC are a really important balance to that, right? You want companies to be able to innovate and make interesting and new products, but you don't want those products to ultimately hurt everyday people. And so I think that's where the FTC is coming in. And so it's interesting, I think, even if we don't necessarily learn what OpenAI or ChatGPT is doing necessarily, it will be interesting to see what the FTC will require OpenAI to do, or require them to change about ChatGPT, because that is something that the FTC can impose on the company. And so that's something that I think will be a really fascinating development. But with that, I've rambled on long enough. But that's sort of my insight into this investigation. But at this time, I want to open up to the floor, answer any questions, or have further discussion if anyone has anything that they want to point out or talk about.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions in the chat as well that we can go through first. So that asks, OpenAI has claimed that the training data it used by scouring the internet data to train its large models does not violate copyright law. Can you speak to whether this is covered in the FTC investigation? Sorry, your voice is not coming through.
How about now?
Yeah, it's coming out.
Okay, sorry, I was asking because I think it cut off at the end there. Do you mind just repeating the question to me?
Yeah, of course. OpenAI has claimed that the training data it used by scouring the internet data to train its large models does not violate copyright law. Can you speak to whether this is covered in the FTC investigation?
I think to a lesser degree, yes. The FTC, their focus is not so much on intellectual property as it is on consumer protection. But I think there are questions relating to sort of what data is being used and whether OpenAI is sort of authorized to use that data. I think the U.S. Copyright Office and maybe to some extent, maybe even like the trademark office would sort of have more say in that. But I mean, currently, there is a lot of dispute, I think, among lawyers and technologists alike about whether, just because information has been published and made available on the internet, whether that can be used to, generate content. I think there's a little bit more of a consensus around text, right, where ChatGPT can sort of provide you with an answer based on, a bunch of text or news articles or, research journals online. There's, I think, a little bit more of a consensus that that is fine, and that is free to use as sort of an output for users. Where I think it's been the most, I think, complicated is when generative AI is used to create artwork, or like videos and music, because there's sort of a debate about whether components of other artists' work is making their way into the final output. And so that's where things are a bit more complicated. But I think with respect to OpenAI and ChatGPT, the text piece of it might be okay. But I am curious to see what the FTC and what other agencies have to say about it.
Yeah, and another question similar to Sada's is, do you think that the SEC will find infractions or privacy concerns with the way that a company like OpenAI has collected their data or dealt with issues like hallucinations?
Yeah, I mean, I think with ChatGPT, we've seen that it's cited fake articles. It's even made up researchers and fake authors when users have asked about citations for a research paper or things like that. And so that's something that I think the FTC is concerned about with respect to things like reputational harm and misinformation. And so I think that's a piece that that will be a focus, and I think a significant focus for the FTC. And it'll be interesting to see what is revealed from that. I do. I'm not entirely sure how how OpenAI will go about addressing it. I think because the tool ultimately is concerned about providing an output, right? Its ultimate end goal is you give it a question or a prompt, and it has to provide you with something. Currently, OpenAI is less concerned about whether that response to your prompt or your query is actually correct, right? And so that's where perhaps there's like a tech literacy component to that too, or some sort of disclaimer or disclosure from OpenAI that's really clear to consumers that says, hey, we can't guarantee that our answers are accurate, right? Like when you use Google to look up answers, hopefully, if as you're doing research and things like that, you aren't relying on the first answer you see, and you're not relying on the first source you see. You're going in, you're fact checking, you're making sure that this is, something that's objective or has enough opinions backing it up. But unfortunately, OpenAI doesn't do that work for the user, and there again have been many cases where it provides false or just made up information. And so I think that's where the FTC is really interested in that like reputational harm aspect, because I think that's a pathway for the agency to look into those AI hallucinations.
I see. And with regard to your last slide, sorry, what do you think other AI companies should do now that the FTC is actively investigating OpenAI?
Yeah, so I think lucky for them, the FTC CID is public. It's been leaked, and so I think it'd be really wise for AI companies to take a look through that list, and make sure that they're complying with what the FTC expects, or can answer those questions in a way that would be satisfactory, I think, for FTC investigators and lawyers and regulators. Things like, how are we retaining data? What is our reinforcement learning process looking like? And do we have enough controls in place to make sure that the information that we are providing to users is accurate and reliable? And so I think those are all things that that I think other AI companies should be able to respond to or have documentation for, so that if they were to be investigated next, they have a blueprint to work off of.
I see. And how can organizations effectively implement machine learning techniques to address issues of bias and misinformation in AI models?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to understanding what their training data is, right? I think a lot of these, to take a step back from ChatGPT for a second, a lot of the AI art generators and AI image generators, they rely on really vast data sets that, yes, include, innocuous artwork, or sometimes in some cases, even artwork that is in the public domain, and that's fine. But a lot of these data sets also include pornography or, private medical photos and information. And those contain issues around whether that data should be used in the first place, but also sometimes there's sensitive information that is included in training data sets. And because the data set is so vast and so large, it can be difficult, I think, to sift through and determine what should be included and what should be excluded, right? And as we know, a lot of these big AI companies rely on people to kind of go through and essentially do that sifting and pay them very tiny amounts to do that. But I think it's a difficult thing. I think that's where a lot of these companies rely on that user reinforcement learning piece to learn from what users provide to them. But again, I think without having the difficult conversation of understanding sort of where the data comes from, it can be difficult to actually address that bias, especially I think when historical data is used. And so that's where I think in any AI application, it's important to grapple with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now I just wanted to change a little bit of what we're talking about, and we can move on to maybe the AI regulatory landscape in the US. Could you elaborate on the differences between the roles of the FTC and Congress in regulating AI and how they complement each other or clash with each other in shaping AI policies?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think again, right, Congress is slower to act for many reasons, but I think one of those reasons is, again, I think balancing remaining competitive sort of on the global stage with protecting individuals, right? There's this push and pull. While the FTC, their more explicit mandate is consumer protection. And so I think that's where, again, I think that's the reason why the FTC is able to act faster. There's less of a concern about whether this will result in less competitiveness or whatever it might be with OpenAI. And they're a lot more focused on how do we make sure that this tool, this technology is not negatively impacting users and consumers. I do see the FTC and Congress kind of acting as separate entities. I think some discussions that I've had is, oh, does this mean that we're going to see more federal regulation? And I don't necessarily think so. Not yet, anyway. I think the FTC acting in this way, right, opening the investigation, that is not a good indicator of whether the federal government at large will act. I think the FTC has been more, I think it has been taking more initiative, I think, to go after tech companies than other regulators have. What we have seen from the federal government is a lot of sort of, oh, these AI company leaders have pledged that they will do things to improve their practices, or they will address bias, or we see Sam Altman saying, oh, we need regulation, or we don't need regulation, and kind of going on this PR campaign, right? But I think a lot of it is kind of for show. I think a lot of it is, at the end of the day, I think the federal government is slow to act because it's a big moneymaker for the country, and so I think I'm hoping that the FTC investigation will reveal something to the public, and I'm hoping that other agencies will also follow suit, or the FTC will be able to pursue other investigations as well. Because I think this is one way to kind of keep those companies in check. And again, I think to most importantly, I think to protect consumers from technology that I don't think is necessarily ready to be used by the public in this way yet.
Yeah, and so that asks, is FTC investigating with a focus on national interests and not so much on a broader ethical implication of OpenAI products?
I would say it's a combination of, I think, national interest and the ethical implications, because I guess that depends on how you would how the national interest is considered, right? I think if you think about like purely business perspective, you might argue, well, we should let these companies do whatever they want so that they can make a lot of money for us and get a lot of users, and we can kind of be the AI sort of hotspot in the world, right? But I would argue that there's a huge national interest in protecting consumers and making sure that the information they're getting from these tools is accurate, that it's not spreading misinformation that can affect I think the functioning of a democracy and things like that. So I think that's where there are a lot of ethical concerns that overlap with that national interest, if you think of it in that way. And I think that's what the FTC is concerned about, right? I think the defamation, the reputational harm, whether your data is secure, what happens if you input something that is very personal and sensitive into ChatGPT. I think those are all things that the FTC is thinking about.
Yeah, and so that also raised her hand. So, yeah. So if you want to add on to your question.
Thank you, guys. So I keep hearing the FTC investigation is about data. So one of the things I struggle with when I teach AI ethics in my AI classes, and I teach just AI ethics at Barcelona Technology School to 4 different master's program. It's very easy to focus on here are the laws, and here we talk about data and GDPR and privacy laws, and because there is precedence. And so I'm curious whether the FTC investigation is focused on data, on it. When I say national security, I mean, is data stored right so that it doesn't impact privacy laws? Is data stored right so that it does not cause cybersecurity issues? Because this is a big company and it's getting huge reach, and more millions of users are using it. So cybersecurity, general data privacy compliance, is it that safe line, or is it bigger than that? Because the general issues of how are they using training data of the internet, and is that violating copyright law, or are they doing unethical, like the hallucination, right? Is that impacting one group of people versus another group of people? Because with generative AI, one of the concepts is fine tuning. So OpenAI could be investigated along with other generative AI companies for their APIs like ChatGPT or Bard and the like, right? The other angle is just ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is an application that has been fine-tuned by OpenAI with certain choices they make. They want it to be liberal. They want it to not talk about certain things. And so when we talk to ChatGPT and I ask it to compare two different things, it talks very safely, because that's a choice that OpenAI has done in how they fine-tune ChatGPT. So is this deeper on the FTC investigation is purely about data, and say, are you storing it right? Are you going to create a cybersecurity attack? Are you set up to protect the country that way? Or are you storing by privacy by design? So if the user doesn't want access to their data when they chat with ChatGPT, are you not storing it? Are you able to delete the data? That kind of thing, more like a GDPR focused investigation. Or is it broader? Hey, you are becoming so big, you're representing the country, you're representing humankind to each other. Now, are you doing this ethically?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually do think that based on what the FTC is focusing on in this investigation, I do think it covers both of those prongs. I think again, the focus of the investigation is on first the privacy and data security piece, and then second is the reputational harm related to AI hallucinations and misinformation. And so I think that first part, right, the privacy and data security, that is focused on the data collection practices, right, as well as the data retention policies that the FTC has. And so how long does it retain the user inputs, for example? I think that goes to the part that you're asking about right, the individual user providing the data and how that's being used. I think that actually the reputational harm piece and the privacy data security part, I think both of those deal with the training data, right? Because the training data can inform AI hallucinations, right? And the tweaking that, as you mentioned, that OpenAI does on their end, right? Like they massage the data in the way that they want to, and they present the data, right, with the tone of how the chatbot responds to you. That is all informing, I think, things like AI hallucination and misinformation. But then the data collection piece under privacy and data security, that is about where is it getting its information from? Is information that it's using comprehensive? Is it objective and fair? Does it have a certain political leaning? Is it biased? Things like that. And so I do think that the investigation, to some extent, does cover both fronts. Does that make sense, Sudha? I'm wondering if did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Because I know there is another closed group Senate meeting of Congress that is with the tech leaders along with the labor leaders. So that's why I was looking whether FTC is just doing very data-centric focus while Congress is saying, hey, think about the impact on jobs and labor market.
Yeah. Oh, then yeah, I think the FTC is less focused on how ChatGPT will impact jobs. I think that's a little bit, I would say that's outside the purview and the mandate of the FTC. The agency that I think would be responsible for that's not coming to me right now. But I do think that's something that Congress would be more concerned about, right? Like the job market. That is something that Congress has power to control. I think it would be different if this was like an antitrust investigation, which is the other piece that the FTC does, right? Like competition. I think if OpenAI was so big and was starting to buy up like other companies, I think that's where maybe the FTC could make a case for, well, now that you're buying up these other companies and you're becoming the only, generative AI tool available to users, maybe there's less of an incentive for you to make sure the data is protected. Maybe there's less of a concern for you to make sure that it's providing reliable answers because there's no other competitor for users to go to, right? If OpenAI started buying up like Google, which wouldn't happen, but if it did that, right, that would raise alarms for the FTC because they'll say, well, you're by doing so, right, by buying up these other competitors, you're giving consumers less options now, right? And so I think that would be the approach I would take. It wouldn't necessarily be about jobs, right? I think that would be a very like practical concern, right? If as companies get bought up, there's less of a need for such a large workforce. But I think even in a antitrust sort of investigation, I think the FTC would still be concerned mostly with consumers. That's really, I think, their focus.
If I may just add one more thing, maybe I'm branching off to a different question from here. So from what I'm hearing you is, it's a capitalist market, and we want to keep capitalism alive and make sure that everybody can compete with everybody, is what I'm hearing when you say they don't want OpenAI to become so big and buy companies such that they have an unfair advantage over some other competition or a small business that could come up, or an open source player that could come up. So the question is this a purely American approach? And would you contrast this with the generative AI guidelines of China, or what the AI laws that's coming out of Europe, which does care about equality and business thriving environment, but they think about more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the American focus has really been on reacting to consumer harm rather than getting ahead of it. I think that's kind of been the case for a long time, where I think the EU is a lot more interested in preserving privacy as a right, while here it's kind of we don't want to inhibit innovation, right? That's sort of the American approach. And I think with the EU, again, I think there's there's more initiative to be proactive rather than reactive. I think some of the, like, an interesting development in China, for example, is including watermarks. I think for China, there's a concern about if anyone has access to generative AI, will individuals start creating messages or content that maybe would be contrary to government messaging, right? Like, that's a concern for the Chinese government. And what motivates them in a lot of instances to regulate AI is to control messaging, I think. And there has been some movement actually in the US to consider using watermarks as well for AI generated content. I think a watermark, for example, would be helpful in instances where addressing things like misinformation, right? Where if that this this AI generated image of Donald Trump being chased by police on the streets, while I'm sure a lot of us know that that's AI generated, I think it's still helpful to have that watermark so that everyone knows that this was created by Stable Diffusion or by Midjourney or something. That I think would be actually helpful for democracy to so people know when information is not reliable, and so they're not making decisions based on false information that's outputted by ChatGPT or any other generative AI tool. But yeah, I think to go back to the root of your question, yeah, I do think that the US is more reactive than I think, especially the EU. I think the EU, with respect to especially privacy, but also I think in AI, is a lot more protective of consumers than certainly Congress is. I think the FTC is doing a better job about it in addressing consumer protection issues. But for example, like the EU is willing to consider things like providing individual users with the ability to sue when AI has harmed them in some way, right? Whether that be something like making an incorrect determination for like loans, right? The US doesn't provide anything like that. Certainly not at the federal level, anyway. And so that's something where it's still lacking. I think like when we saw the AI Bill of Rights being proposed, it has a lot of, I think, good ideas, but a criticism that I've been pretty public about is that none of those things are enforceable, right? The Bill of Rights in the US is as powerful and as important as it is because all of those rights are enforceable and protected by law. And so when those rights are infringed upon, you as an individual can have some recourse. But the AI Bill of Rights is kind of trying to ape the concepts of the Bill of Rights without actually providing individual users with the ability to get any actual remedy, right? If an AI makes a false statement about you that affects your reputation, if an AI turns you down from, leasing an apartment or something, or if a university or school uses AI in some way to look at applications, and you feel like you were unfairly rejected by a school, you really don't have any recourse, and you can't even say like, oh, I'd rather have a human, evaluate me than AI, right? The AI Bill of Rights says that a company should do that, but it doesn't say that they have to, and it doesn't have any kind of penalty for that company or any way for you to actually fix it. And so the EU, especially in that space, is a lot more ahead than the US.
Yeah, and so therefore, would you say essentially that the US has been relatively lenient on AI regulation compared to the EU and other countries like China, as you were mentioning? And in that case, what do you think that the best next steps would be for federal agencies to prevent the unlawful handling of data and having stricter AI regulation?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see agencies like the FTC receive more funding to be able to do investigations like this. And like I imagine this investigation, OpenAI, will be more or less all-consuming for the FTC for some time. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of information to go through. The FTC is not a large organization. And I think, again, I think Congress is far slower to act. I think having an agency that is a little bit more independent and is, their mandate is consumer protection, right? I think that's the way to go about it. I think if we're concerned about how this technology impacts users and consumers, I think we need more agencies to act. And it's difficult to ask them to do something when they don't have enough resources or enough people to actually open these investigations. And so I'd like to see that happen. I don't see it happening, unfortunately. But yeah, and I think where the US has certainly put out a lot of sort of nice platitudes and here are things that companies should do. I think until those things actually become laws and regulations with actual consequences for those companies, we won't really see much change, right? I think almost every time, if companies can, have to choose between getting more users, earning more money, and actually, protecting individual users, they're going to choose the path of being able to generate more revenue for themselves almost every time. And so there needs to be that counterbalance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Do we have any other questions in the audience before we wrap up the Q&A? Okay, so that has a comment. France has a bill in review. SREN bill. Okay. And any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay. Okay, then if we don't have any other
Pariya, if you don't mind, can you just share the generative AI book.org site, so people can sign up if they want more information, because I want to give them a list just on generative AI. People usually sign up and get everything about AI and all my research topics and my newsletter. But if you want to share that, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely share that. Okay, I will share my screen. Okay, so can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, can you close the pop-up window? And change the URL so people can see generativeaibook.org. Thank you, Pariya.
Okay, so yeah, so basically, yes, go to generativeaibook.org to get generative AI resources for all of our books.
Yeah, sorry if I may add, you can stop the share. I mean, I didn't want to just show a big copy of my book. Can I add to that, Pariya, if you don't mind? Yeah, thank you. So I have this book, Generative AI, a primer for product and business managers. It's on Kindle, guys. In fact, many of you are my students, so you already know about it. But I wanted Pariya to share this generativeaibook.org as a site, because annoying pop-up will show up, and then if you sign up, then you get to be part of a list there where you will get just generative AI resources. Like every time here we have learning resources, somebody comes and talks about the tech, somebody comes and talks about the regulation, somebody talks about different dimensions of it, but there's too much content out there. So I just wanted to know if specifically, because there are newcomers here who said they are new to generative AI, so there will be learning resources that we plan to send out. And just on generative AI, if that's something you want to learn. And Pariya, do you want to tell them about prompt engineering, that you have a newsletter planned coming out? Is that something people can sign up to?
Yeah, so for the to sign up for the prompt engineering newsletter, which we had a recent prompt engineering webinar with Robert. And to sign up, go to bit.ly/prompt_engineering_webinar, and then you'll receive an email each week with our newsletter, resources and opportunities, and also watch the webinar with Robert.
Thank you. Because people keep asking us, we see all this, and then we don't get to is there more content? How do we learn this and stuff like that? And I just realized that we have like 5 or 8 years of content on Weekly, where at least 3 years worth of AI content. So we're trying to streamline that. So give us feedback. Do you just want to go back to the archives, go to our YouTube and just watch them, and just come here and have this conversation as a community? Or do you like more newsletters, more focused newsletters? We just want to help consume that content, but for you to bring your perspective, that's more important for us. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and for those joining us today, I also have a form that you can share your feedback on, and I can share that on LinkedIn as well, for Weekly WED, and speakers you want to see, and your general feedback on everything. So yeah. Okay, with that, we can wrap up then. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation and answering the questions very well, and for joining us today. And thank you for all of us, who are joining us on Zoom today and on LinkedIn, and who will watch later. And for those who haven't signed up for a Weekly WED, to have access to all of our Weekly WEDs, you can join at bit.ly/Weekly WED registration, and share that link with anyone you think would be interested in joining our community. And with that, we can close.
Thank you so much, Pariya, for putting this together. I appreciate that.
Thank you to everyone who joined today, and for the questions as well.
And thank you, Patrick.
Thanks for having me, and loved all the questions and discussion.
Okay, I'm going to end the live stream, which I think we can just end the meeting.